Hi everyone, I'm Shirt Langenhoven-Heber, and in this video, I'll be focusing on key features of cross-sectional studies. To give you some context, studies can generally be divided into two types, observational and experimental. Observational studies are further grouped into three main categories: cross-sectional, case control, and cohort studies. In this video, we'll be focusing on cross-sectional studies. When planning for or critically evaluating a cross-sectional study, there are a few key features that need to be considered. First, let's explore the purpose of cross-sectional studies. Cross-sectional studies are commonly used to determine the prevalence and factors associated with a specific outcome. These factors and outcomes could be certain conditions, behaviors, or characteristics within a population. So let's start with an example of prevalence. Investigators might report on the percentage of people in a country experiencing a mental health condition. This could be how many individuals are living with anxiety or depression in a given year. They could also report the prevalence of adolescent behavior, such as cannabis use, in the last 3 months. Or they may have investigated the proportion of school-going adolescents with high levels of self-esteem. The data collected in these studies can not only identify the prevalence of these conditions, behaviors, or characteristics, but can also show the relationships or associations between factors. For example, they might investigate whether high or low social support, emotional regulation, and substance use are associated with symptoms of depression in school-going adolescents. However, it's important to note that cross-sectional studies cannot establish cause and effect. Cross-sectional studies are essentially a snapshot in time. In other words, they collect data at a single point in time, allowing researchers to assess prevalence and other variables at specific moments. Similar to other observational studies, cross-sectional studies are observational and descriptive. This means researchers do not manipulate the variables or intervene in any way. Given there's no manipulation of variables or tracking participants over time, cross-sectional studies have low internal validity. This means they cannot determine causality or track changes over time. For studying changes within individuals or populations over extended periods, longitudinal studies are more suitable. Next, we will look at appropriate research questions for cross-sectional studies. Examples include: what is the prevalence of depression among adults attending primary healthcare facilities? And what factors are associated with depression among adults attending primary healthcare facilities? You will notice I use the words factors associated with depression rather than factors that caused depression. As I've mentioned, this is because cross-sectional studies cannot establish causality. The next key feature of cross-sectional studies is the sampling method. The sample for a cross-sectional study should ideally represent the population being studied to ensure that the findings can be generalized. Generalizability can also be referred to as external validity, which is important in a cross-sectional study. Sampling methods include random sampling, stratified sampling, and convenience sampling. Random sampling gives everyone an equal chance of being included, while stratified sampling ensures that different subgroups within the population are represented. Both of these methods can enhance the external validity of a study and the generalizability of its findings. Convenience sampling, where participants are selected based on their availability, may be used for practical reasons. However, it can affect the study's external validity. The study sample might not fully represent the population, limiting the generalizability of the findings. Ensuring a representative sample is crucial for maintaining external validity, limiting bias, and drawing accurate conclusions about the broader population. The fourth key feature of a cross-sectional study is data collection. Data in cross-sectional studies is collected through methods such as questionnaires, interviews, or observations. Participants are asked about their conditions, behaviors, or other characteristics. Cross-sectional studies assess multiple variables at the same time. These can be demographic, social, behavioral, or health-related variables, depending on the study's focus. This can lead to the discovery of associations and relationships between variables. It is important to note that participants are not followed over time, so these studies cannot show changes or developments over time. Key feature number 5 is the potential biases from the sampling method and data collection strategies used in cross-sectional study. Sampling bias in general arises when certain individuals or groups have a higher or lower likelihood of being included in the sample. This can potentially distort the study results. Let's discuss 2 types of sampling bias. Just remember that there are many more types of bias which you can explore. The first is volunteer or self-selection bias. People who volunteer for a study may represent a certain subgroup of the target population. This could be a subgroup who had higher energy levels than the rest of the population, who did not volunteer. Second, we have non-response bias. Non-response bias occurs when certain people or subgroups of the target population refuse to participate in the study. For example, people living with depressive symptoms may have lower energy and motivation than people not experiencing these symptoms. This can lead some people to not participate in the study, resulting in non-response bias. Key feature number 6 explores the measurement used in cross-sectional studies. Measures included should be reliable and valid in the setting that they are used. This means that they need to have good psychometric properties. Psychometric properties refer to the characteristics of a mental health measure, namely the reliability and validity of the measure. Reliability refers to the consistency and stability of the measure. On the other hand, validity refers to the extent a measure accurately captures the construct it is intended to measure. We always need to consider the potential for measurement or information bias in cross-sectional studies. There are several types of measurement or information bias to consider. This is not by any means an exhaustive list. For instance, given the self-report nature of many observational studies, measurements might be influenced by the participants' awareness of being studied. This is known as the Hawthorne effect, or by the observer or researcher's expectations, referred to as observer bias. Further, given the self-report nature of many observational studies, recall bias may be present. Recall bias occurs when participants fail to accurately remember past events or experiences. Finally, social desirability bias arises when participants provide responses they believe researchers want to hear. When reading a paper, it is essential to recognize that researchers may not always be able to prevent these biases. However, they should acknowledge their potential presence and account for them when interpreting the study's findings. Transparency about these biases, along with an estimation of their potential impact, should be addressed in the discussion section of the paper. Another key feature of cross-sectional studies is the possibility of confounding variables. Confounding is a systematic error or type of bias that can distort findings. Confounders are independently associated with the outcome but are not on the causal pathway. The effect of a confounder can be minimized in a study design. We must try to control all known potential confounders. Let me give an example. Imagine we want to conduct a study on the relationship between drinking coffee and anxiety levels in the workplace. We decide to observe a group of individuals over a month and record their daily coffee consumption and anxiety levels. Let's say that we notice people who drink more coffee tend to have higher anxiety levels. However, we might overlook the fact that these individuals also have other common traits that could be contributing to their anxiety. For instance, it could be that these individuals work high-stress jobs, which may lead them to drink more coffee to stay alert during long hours. The stress from their job is a confounding variable because it influences both their coffee consumption and their anxiety levels. So, in reality, it's not the coffee causing the anxiety, but the stressful work environment. Another consideration when it comes to cross-sectional studies is taking note of reporting guidelines. The Equator Network website is very helpful when it comes to identifying appropriate reporting guidelines, as you can see from the list. Equator stands for Enhancing the Quality and Transparency of Health Research. The guideline often used for cross-sectional and other EPI observational studies is STROBE, Strengthening the Reporting of Observational Studies in Epidemiology. There are study design-specific STROBE guidelines for the specific types of observational studies, including cross-sectional studies. When putting all this information together, we can identify several strengths of cross-sectional studies. First, they are relatively quick, easy, and cheap to conduct. They are faster to conduct compared to studies requiring long-term follow-ups, because all data is collected at a single point in time. Additionally, they are generally less expensive, making them a practical choice for researchers with limited budgets. Second, data on all variables are collected at once. This provides a clear snapshot of the population situation at that moment. Third, given that multiple outcomes and exposures are studied at the same time, this helps in understanding complex relationships within the data. Finally, cross-sectional studies are useful for descriptive analysis, providing valuable information about the prevalence of conditions or behaviors within a population. While they cannot establish causation, they can reveal patterns and relationships that may lead to new research questions or hypotheses for further investigation. When looking at all the key features of cross-sectional studies, we can also identify some major limitations. First, cross-sectional studies have low internal validity, making it difficult to establish temporal relationships. For example, if a study finds a relationship between social support and depression, it's unclear whether low social support leads to depression or if depression leads to low social support. Further, potential confounding variables might influence the observed relationships, complicating the interpretation of causality. Second, another major limitation to cross-sectional studies is the potential for selection and non-response bias. In addition to having good sampling methods such as random or stratified sampling, a good response rate in cross-sectional studies is essential. Otherwise, the results will not be representative of the population we are studying. It is vital to manage and minimize non-response in a cross-sectional study, as it will impact on the external validity of the results. Third, Cross-sectional studies rely on self-report from participants, which introduces the potential for measurement or information biases such as recall bias and social desirability bias. Finally, cross-sectional studies are better suited for examining prevalence, in other words, the proportion of individuals with a particular characteristic at a given time. Also, these studies may not provide insights into incidence. Incidence is the rate at which new cases of a condition or behavior occur over time. It is important to consider these strengths and limitations when designing, interpreting, and generalizing findings from cross-sectional studies. As a reminder, here is a list of 10 things to consider when planning or assessing an observational study, whether it's cross-sectional, case control, or cohort. I do hope you found this video helpful in understanding the key features of a cross-sectional study.